Well, good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Church here in Salt Lake City. Our service format is going to be a little different this morning in our effort to cover a really difficult, tough, even sensitive subject. Some may interpret this a bit personally. We're going to be addressing white supremacy and Unitarian Universalism, which to many feels like an oxymoron, but it's not. And that's why it takes two ministers this morning to delve into the subject. Now, some of you might well be aware already of this national conversation that's taking place, a conversation that draws our liberal religion into the shadows of white supremacy. Now, to be clear, we're not talking about white supremacy as was manifest in Charlottesville, Virginia, when an unruly mob, none of them nice people, trust me, none of them were nice people, displayed their hatred of non-whites in violent ways. We want to explore how much wider the effects of white supremacy, how widely and influential they really are, and they're not necessarily manifested in overt violent forms. Now, every member of this church should be getting, along with every member of Unitarian Universalist churches throughout the country, should be getting a magazine called the UU World, which is a decent journal published by the Unitarian Universalist Association. How many of you get the UU World? Oh, okay, great. In their fall issue, which mostly reviewed the 2017 General Assembly in New Orleans, where incidentally we elected our first woman president of the UUA. This last issue of the magazine probably stirred a lot of confusion, if not downright consternation. Now, most of the major events at the convention featured African American speakers, and there was a distinct African-American vibe throughout the General Assembly. And of course, we may want to applaud that and feel proud that we have finally somehow broken through a race barrier. Our lack of diversity has always posed heartache for our progressive ways and tendencies. But the convention was not about self-congratulation. It was an opportunity to finally hear black voices speak. And the message clearly pointed to white supremacy within Unitarian Universalism. And echoing that was the message among some of the white leaders who got up to speak, and their message was really quite the same, including our new president, Susan Frederick Gray. A little background. Last March, our UU president, Peter Morales, resigned amid charges of white supremacy. And this was regarding the hiring practices of the UUA, which critics said favored white people, especially white male ministers who were chosen for senior positions. Now, this may feel odd, since Morales is Hispanic and his predecessor, Bill Sinkford, is African American. But essentially, we have what were token minorities running the UUA. They were so-called, let's say, window dressing for a progressive denomination. But outside the presidency, there was no real leadership of color. And when there is no black leadership at headquarters, then it is extremely difficult to cultivate black leadership in local churches, difficult to recruit black ministers into our Unitarian Universalist denomination. So hard to do when there are no mentors at the very top. When Morales resigned, the UUA Board of Trustees appointed 3 interim co-presidents. presidents. All three of them were of color. Their new hiring practices aim to achieve 40% people of color in professional and managerial positions. Now, I think we would all agree that these changes signal hope for our future. And this morning we're going to try to flesh out what these changes may mean. Diversity may well be everyone's goal, but it means huge changes, not only in leadership. In fact, that part's easy. It means changes in how we do worship as well. We are painfully white in our liturgy, our messages, our music, in what we value as meaningful, and in our view of the world. In our own estimation, Unitarians are exempt from any and all accusations of white supremacy. I mean, hey, just look at our UU principles. Listen to what's said at our worship services. But the current philosophy is to examine our assumptions more carefully. It's important yet painful as we confront our own participation in white supremacy.
Dr. King talked about having a dream. Today, we can easily look around and see that the dream has not been realized. Why? Was the dream lacking in power? Is racism just too powerful to overcome? No, I don't believe that. But I do believe that racism is sneaky. In order to vanquish it once and for all, we cannot chop it off at the base. We must dig deep into the soil of our nation's culture and uproot it. And if you, like me, have ever done any gardening, then you know that sometimes when you go to uproot a tough weed, you discover that the roots go much deeper than you ever imagined. Sometimes the whole garden will have to be turned over before you can really find that root and pull it out once and for all. The question, are Unitarian Universalists white supremacists, is awfully provocative, and so I applaud y'all for coming out today to hear about it instead of staying home and doing the Times crossword puzzle. I especially applaud you if you are a person of color who turned out today and chooses to be here in a room full of white folks working out our foolishness. To you, I say, thank you, thank you, thank you for staying in this work with us, for holding us accountable to the best that we can be. And I and Tom are available to you first after worship today if you'd like to talk about it. And if you're visiting today, I want you to know that today's service might feel like a bit of inside baseball. Perhaps you've already figured that out. Our denomination, however, is not the only one muddling through this problem. Most mainline Christian denominations, many synagogues and most mosques, and many other people of faith are facing America's original sin because we have no other choice. We must face it or perish. So if you're interested in joining the conversation, you are welcome here. It might be uncomfortable, but at least we're all in it together. I have a secret to tell y'all. We are not going to solve racism today. There is nothing that Tom or I can say in this brief hour that is going to fix it. What I hope to do, and what I think Tom hopes to do as well, is to put a seed between your teeth that cries out to be removed. Talking about taking responsibility for racism is deeply irritating, and it cannot be ignored. It must be done. Today's work is work of the heart. I'm speaking from my heart, I invite you to listen with your hearts. And in any great work of the heart, we begin with faith. Faith is not believing without evidence. Rather, faith is the assurance, the certainty that the work is worth doing and that it can be done. To have faith is to choose faith. There is no other way. And the symbol of our faith is the chalice, a flame lit within a common cup, providing light and truth for all who can see it. Light of hope, light of faith, light of love, shine in our hearts this morning. I invite you now to rise in body or in spirit and let us sing together. Number 121, 210, Wade in the Water.
Boy, that hymn does spell trouble, doesn't it? Trouble. I love it. And trouble, I think, may be exactly what we're after this morning. We arrive at interesting narratives to account for our failure in offering racial diversity in Unitarian Universalist congregations. We tell ourselves, and I'm really paraphrasing what I've heard over and over again throughout my entire ministry, which began in 1975. We say publicly that our churches offer such intellectual richness that, of course, it's a bit intimidating for those who may have been on a different educational track. But it's really too bad that African Americans are missing from our churches because we really want to serve everyone. We proudly proclaim. That's okay. I'm not keeping track, but probably that's the second time this has happened in the. We proudly proclaim that we have such high liberal and progressive standing that it's hard to fathom why people of color just wouldn't naturally be drawn to us. Now, surely there must be some minority people who would value, first of all, our social justice outreach, and of course there would be many who would deeply appreciate our history, going back to the distinguished Unitarian abolitionists in New England. And aside from all of that, we really are very nice people. And so sincere. Sometimes our narrative gets a little analytical. African Americans, we say, understandably prefer their own cultural religious heritage. And regardless how stimulating our services may be, the bottom line is that we all choose to hang with those in our tribe. Sometimes Unitarians will blame the demographics of the city where they live or the neighborhood where the church is located. Not enough African Americans to draw from. There's always some justification for the contradiction, the very contradiction of having a progressive and inclusive language and nothing really to show for it. But as the Reverend Mark Morrison Reed observed at the recent General Assembly in New Orleans, and Mark is a retired African-American UU minister, African Americans are absent from our denomination, he says, because Unitarian Universalism and across the entire American milieu, black lives don't matter. That's a slap in the face. My God, instinctively, we want to challenge that. Black lives do matter, we respond. We even have a sign outside our church that says that. But there's so much we really don't know or understand. 60 years ago, 10% of Unitarian congregations had African Americans serving their respective board of trustees. In the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s, there were African American board presidents in UU churches in New York, Boston, Seattle, Richmond, Washington, D.C., Cincinnati, Philadelphia, Durham, North Carolina. So this idea that Unitarianism just doesn't appeal to African Americans represents a false narrative. It's not so much that African Americans are missing from our congregations, rather than institutionally, we have done a really good job of ignoring African American contributions to Unitarianism and Universalism. For example, the founding of the Free Religious Fellowship, a largely African American congregation on Chicago's South Side. This gathering was attributed to Ken Patton, a white minister who played a very minor role in organizing the Free Religious Fellowship. Likewise, the founders of the Frederick Douglass Center in Chicago were mistakenly identified as a white husband and wife team rather than raising any mention of its core contributor, Fannie Barrier Williams. In a 1973 publication by the UUA Women's Federation called 2 Centuries of Distinguished UU Women, not one African-American woman is included among the 102 biographies. There were a lot of very significant black women that have given so much to forming and helping UU churches in the last 2 centuries. There is this belief that black people are simply missing from Unitarian Universalism, yet how many know that Gloucester Dalton was the signatory at the founding of John Murray's Universalist congregation in 1785? African Americans were charter members at the founding of the Universalist Society of Philadelphia in 1801, Flushing, New York in 1907, Sitka, Alaska, 1955, the Eno River Congregation in Durham, North Carolina. There was an all-black Unitarian church in Chicago in 1887, which lasted a year. No support from headquarters. In 1892, a black Universalist church was founded in Norfolk, Virginia. No support. In 1894 and 1902, black Universalist churches were founded in Suffolk, Virginia, and Ocean View, Virginia. The founder of the Suffolk Church also appealed to headquarters for funding a seminary to train black Universalist ministers. No support. In 1908, Ethelred Brown started a Unitarian congregation in Jamaica, Queens, which means a lot to me personally because that's where I'm from. Well, that congregation never survived. Brown then moved his dream of a mixed or predominantly black church, moved it up to Harlem in 1920, founded the Harlem Community Church. Not only did our headquarters on 25 Beacon Street in Boston fail to support a Unitarian congregation in Harlem, they stripped Reverend Brown of his ministerial credentials for reasons that were never really fully disclosed. Let's stop and think. Can you imagine if we had a UU presence in Harlem today? Our own founder of this church, Samuel Atkins Elliott, was president of the American Unitarian Association at that time. I'm just scratching the surface. The point being, our children learn nothing of this because there is no curricula, and not for adults either. But there may well be another reason for African Americans missing from our churches. In 1989, the UUA did a survey on worship preferences. They listed 5 options. You go to church because, A, B, C, D, E. And so in this survey, I think we're able to ascertain a couple of key clues as to why our congregations are so strikingly white today. We learned from the survey that among white Unitarians, the most important element of worship was intellectual stimulation. African American Unitarians, not that many, but enough to have an impact on the survey, responded that what was important for them in worship was celebrating common values. And then the next thing they ticked off was hope, then vision, then music. Intellectual stimulation was dead last. So a fascinating profile emerges that really suggests a racial chasm. One group of worshipers who never had a concern about maintaining their civil rights, human rights, dignity, voting rights, other political rights, loved the intellectual freedom to entertain profound ideas. And the other group never received the blessings of living in a democratic country. They yearned to hear and express hope while cultivating the promise of a new life, a new society, new opportunities for them and their children and their kin. That's what worship was all about. The intellectualism sought by white Unitarians ties into a long history going back to 19th century Unitarianism, which prided itself on being mostly part of the Harvard-educated elite. In fact, the founder of American Unitarianism, William Ellery Channing, would not condescend to speak to a Universalist minister, Hosea Ballou in particular. The Unitarians were urbane, moneyed, powerful. The Universalists were rural, far less educated, had little wealth, and they were pretty powerless. If class distinctions are part of our Unitarian history and psyche and identity, this does not bode well for creating a worship environment conducive to diversity. If the intellectual component were removed from our worship today, our Sunday morning gatherings would be, frankly, unrecognizable. And yet we honestly fail to grasp why black people are missing from our pews nationwide. Unitarians' rich intellectual history makes visible the concept that liberal philosophy does not preclude white supremacy. The liberalism that motivated abolitionists to rid the institution of slavery still made intellectual distinctions between whites and blacks. I mean, opposing the idea of owning another human being and treating him or her in such barbaric ways, well, that's one thing. Proposing equal status between the races, well, that's something else entirely. The typically liberal-minded Unitarian shared a philosophy much like Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln urged black people to leave the U.S. He said, and I quote Lincoln, even when, and he addressed this to a group of blacks, when you cease to be slaves, you are yet far removed from being placed on an equality with the white race. Lincoln, obviously known for his eloquent Emancipation Proclamation and everything that flowed from that in terms of liberation from slavery, still perpetuated a white supremacist ideology. Now again, white supremacy extends far beyond its negative stereotypes of hooded Klansmen and white nationalist rowdies. Now, a perfect example of liberalism's well-meaning white supremacy, perfect example may be Charles William Eliot, Harvard University's longest-serving president in history. He went from 1869 until 1909. It's 40 years. He was a cousin of T.S. Eliot and father of Samuel Atkins Eliot, who founded this church in 1891. Now, it was only a handful of years after this church was established that Charles William Eliot delivered speeches very dear to his heart on the subject of racial purity. Racial purity was threatened, he declared, by immigration. And he told a gathering at the Harvard Club in San Francisco, and I quote, "Each nation should keep its stock pure." So was Charles William Eliot a Unitarian? Of course he was, as was his own father, Samuel Atkins Eliot I, who was not only a Unitarian minister, but mayor of Boston. The Eliots kept their stock very pure. Our founder, by the way, was really Samuel Atkins Eliot II. Harvard University, under the direction and leadership of Charles William Eliot, was the prime force behind the eugenics movement in the United States. Eugenics insisted that human progress depended on promoting reproduction by the best people in the best combinations and preventing the unworthy from having children. Eliot supported forced sterilization of people declared to be feeble-minded, physically disabled, criminalistic, and the beautiful catch-all phrase that, of course, only the elite can interpret, those who were otherwise flawed. Eliot wrote a widely circulated paper on, it was called, The Suppression of Moral Defectives. Now, I can't help but believe that the founder of this church, who, as I mentioned, became president of our denomination, and as he was growing up, that he wasn't privy to a few dinner conversations with his dad about racial inferiority. Why didn't the American Unitarian Association support black churches in Chicago and New York? I have my hunches. The eugenics movement attracted huge support from progressives and intellectuals because they use science to make the world better. The successor to Eliot as president at Harvard, a fellow by the name of A. Lawrence Lowell, ran the university until 1933, called for homogeneity in a democracy. That you couldn't have a democracy without homogeneity. And so white nationalists today are not just making this stuff up. White supremacy does not necessarily imply thugs beating up freedom riders or Bull Connor unleashing dogs against black protesters. It's far more subtle. And it's hardly even discernible. Identifying the inferiority of blacks despite their rights to obtain civil rights is subtly rooted in history. You can go back to the Fugitive Slave Act, sending black people to Liberia, and then as we move along in time, eugenics, no funding for black UU churches or black UU ministerial leadership. Moving on in time, Willie Horton, tying medical care to work requirements. And then the stuff that's really infused in our language today. Law and order, what does that suggest? Pointing to model minorities. War on drugs. Race neutral. Personal responsibility. The achievement gap. Colorblind. Moving on to unfair hiring practices by the UUA. So let me repeat an earlier quote by a black UU minister. In the context of Unitarian Universalism and, of course, the entire American milieu, black lives don't matter. I think we're probably aghast upon hearing that for the first time. But now, maybe we can listen to that charge more openly and identify its truth and learn from our history. Now, we can begin by changing the narrative we tell each other, that narrative about why African Americans are missing from our pews. As David was warming up this morning, he said, "Listen to these chords." And they were really amazing. Really great piece. Thank you for introducing us. Just a couple of announcements. Please take a look at your order of service, and again, just witness the amazing range of programs that we offer. Let me just mention that during a cup of coffee, you may want to take a look at the table that offers all the opportunities to work on behalf of the sanctuary movement in this church. Maybe a contemporary Underground Railroad. I think that's kind of an image. Also, a social justice council meeting will be held after church at around 12:20. All are invited to that. And on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday at 7 o'clock, Monica and I will really be happy to facilitate a UU orientation class aimed at mostly those who are relatively new, brand new, a little bit new, newish, whatever. Please register at the table, the Congregational Life table, if you can come on Tuesday, especially if you need some child care. That's going to be really, really important for us to determine. The offering will now gratefully be received, a chance to greet one another and bid each other a good morning.
When my daughter, Hannah, was about 7 years old, I remember once we were having a conversation about Black Lives Matter and why we still need to fight racism. And I remember she said to me, "Wait a minute, Mom, I thought Dr. King got black people their rights back in the 60s. Oh boy. In that moment, I was shaking my head and asking myself, where did I go wrong? Okay, first of all, honey, Dr. King didn't give anybody their rights. Our rights are ours because we're human. Nobody gives another person rights. Dr. King was working toward making the law recognize the rights that people already have. That's just for starters. I think many of us who are parents have had that moment of sort of having to reframe what is learned in school and reconsider the language that we're using to talk about the problems of the day. But there's a deeper issue here to straighten out, a tougher issue. Last week, as we celebrated the life of Dr. King, we asked, as perhaps we do every year, why haven't we cracked this nut of racism in our society yet? Why haven't we been able to realize Dr. King's dream of a truly equitable society in which people are judged by their character rather than the color of their skin? As it turns out, Dr. King himself gave us a clue. In the last book he wrote before his assassination, he wrote, "Whites, it must frankly be said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It is an aspect of their sense of superiority that the white people of America believe they have so little to learn." Now, I find it funny that out of all the Dr. King quotes I saw on social media last weekend, that one didn't go viral. Why not? It's because we white folks generally get pretty uncomfortable implicating ourselves in racism. Isn't that just about the worst thing you can call a white person these days? A racist? Because we know what a racist looks like, even without the white hood. Racists no longer need white hoods to be recognized, do they? We tend to equate racism with hatred and white supremacy with Nazis and the Klan, and we can easily define ourselves as not that. We're the good guys, right? We're not racists. We're not white supremacists. So it hurts when we hear our denomination's leaders say that we have all been charged with fomenting white supremacy. But just as feminism had multiple waves as it addresses more insidious forms of sexism, so our fight against racism continues to evolve as we get closer and closer to the bottom of the matter. Just as we no longer use the word that Dr. King used in his letter to a Birmingham jail that we talked about last week, where he refers to people of color as African Americans as Negroes, so we also need to evolve the language that we use across the board to talk about our fight with racism. A helpful contemporary definition of racism comes from writer Joe Fagan. Racism is racial prejudice backed up with power and resources. So then, what is white supremacy? White supremacy isn't just about whiteness being the best. White supremacy in the United States means that the way white folks do things is assumed to be the normal way, the default way, or even the American way. And the way other folks do things is diverse at best, aberrant at worst. In other words, white supremacy is the culture created by systems of racism, systems that often seem invisible to white people, and that because they are invisible to white people, it makes it exceedingly difficult to unravel. And as one of my colleagues is known to say, culture eats systems for breakfast. And now this is key. White supremacy does not require any actual white supremacists in order to perpetuate itself. It only requires good, decent white people to remain ignorant or indifferent or defensive, to have no motivation to make sacrifices in order to change things because they can't see racism, because we can't see it. But as we know, just because we can't see it doesn't mean it isn't there. Our siblings of color face challenges every single day that those of us who are white will never experience. They still have to work twice as hard to get half as much. They are still denied the right to vote in many places, even after we elected a black president. They still suffer indignity and mistreatment every single day, even from white folks who claim they don't have a racist bone in their bodies. And now don't jump to a White House conclusion there. Who among us who are white has not said those words, or at least thought them? I know I have. Now, remember when I said that talking about whiteness is extremely uncomfortable? So I bet some of you out there are feeling a little uncomfortable with this. I get that. But this discomfort is the sweet spot. This is the place where the work begins. We've participated in marches and protests. We've called our legislators. We've even worn safety pins. But remembering that white supremacy culture is not only upheld by racists, but also by millions of people who think there's no problem at all, we affirm that we are not just going to change the words we use to talk about this problem. We are going to turn inward into our own hearts and change ourselves and build a whole new way forward. The Reverend Dr. Rosemary Bray McNatt, an African-American woman and the president of our Star King Seminary, puts it this way: we can read Thoreau and Emerson to one another, quote Rilke and Alice Walker and Howard Thurman and think good and noble thoughts about ourselves, but if we cannot bring justice into the small circle of our own individual lives, we cannot hope to bring justice to the world. And if we do not bring justice to the world, none of us is safe and none of us will survive. Nothing that Unitarian Universalists do is more important than making justice real here, where we are. Hard as diversity is, it is our most important task. If we want our church to be truly multicultural, if we want to realize our own dreams, if we want to live out the promise of our second principle of justice and equity for all, then we have to acknowledge that we have to do something different than what we've done before. We who are white will have to give up something. We will have to listen without judgment and believe what we are hearing, even if, especially if, it is hard to believe. We will have to be trustworthy. I am convinced that white supremacy culture is dismantled one trustworthy relationship at a time, and that relationships of trust are built one trustworthy conversation at a time. So let us commit to be trustworthy by listening without looking away. It's not going to be easy. It's guaranteed to be messy. There will be mistakes and hard feelings and conflict and discomfort, but it is worth it. I'm in it for the long haul, and the Unitarian Universalist Association is with us too. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Come with me. Let us close our worship today with number 121, We'll Build a Land. I invite you to rise in body or in spirit.
It'll be a long journey from recognition to understanding to transformation. It'll be a hard journey as we examine society, institutions, ourselves. It will be a rewarding journey when one day we will congregate with our black sisters and brothers, sharing in spirit, in worship, and kinship.